Hey everyone, this is Carter. Welcome to another episode of Making It Up. So I'm having a great time with this show, with this conversation series, because I'm getting to know just fascinating people. And it's great when you have a conversation where you can kind of feel that there's a connection, that there's people are willing to kind of be vulnerable and to reveal things. And sometimes that happens, sometimes it doesn't. But that's kind of always my goal. And today I talked to Mark Sullivan, and it was one of those conversations where, I wasn't sure how it was going to go, and it became pretty revealing, and it was just fascinating. I mean, Mark alone, his credentials are pretty fascinating. So Mark has written 18 books, and he's also co-authored books with James Patterson. So he's got 5 books with James Patterson that have hit number 1 on the New York Times bestseller list. So that's pretty amazing. But even his solo stuff is phenomenal. And you look at Beneath A Scarlet Sky, which came out in 2017. You go to Amazon, it's like 51,000 reviews on there. So he's really created a tremendous readership, and hearing the story behind, the conception of that story, of that book is really engaging. His latest book is The Last Green Valley, which came out in 2021. And it's also been a number 1 bestseller as well. So he's really an interesting guy to talk to. And, talked about his growing up in Boston as a kid and just having kind of free reign, and hearing about how Tony Robbins ended up having a massive influence in his life. And at the end, we make up a great story based on a sentence from James Clavell's Noble House. And it was great storytelling with Mark, because I think we were both kind of in a very similar zone, and it just was very fluid, and that doesn't always happen. And it's a great feeling when it does. So I hope you enjoy. This is my conversation with Mark Sullivan. You're in beautiful Bozeman, aren't you?
I am. Right now I'm in Big Sky, but yeah, just outside Bozeman.
Wow. What brought you there?
I love to ski, I love to fly fish, and I love to bow hunt. So this is about as good as it gets for all 3 of those things.
Oh, that's fantastic. Yeah, I'm just outside of Boulder, Colorado. And I went skiing for the first time in a couple of years last week. I took my son and we went out to Winter Park, and it was tremendous. I'd forgotten how nice it is to ski, but normally it's such a pain in the ass when you're in Denver, because if you're just driving up for the day, it's not worth it.
Sure.
So where do you go
You got to fight.
there?
Big Sky,
Yeah.
it's south of Bozeman. We have a small cabin on the mountain, and I live up here all winter. I ski in the morning for about an hour, and then I go right.
That's fantastic. Do you know
It
the
is.
Yellowstone Club up there?
I do. One of my sons teaches in there, and the other one used to teach in there.
Oh, amazing. Yeah, I used to work in a job. I used to be a hotel appraiser, and we were asked to value Yellowstone Club when the couple was going through their divorce.
Oh
So
yeah.
I spent a few days up there, and the GM is like, "Well, you can only see this place on skis." So we just skied the entire, and I was just like, I couldn't wrap my head around the wealth. And in fact, it actually inspired a book of mine that never got published, but the idea of, like, a club like that, what kind of people are there, and what are the vulnerabilities of having those kinds of powerful
Sure.
people all collected there at the same time.
I took the same thing, and it did turn into a book called Triple Cross.
Oh, really?
Oh yeah.
Oh, wow.
For a long time there, I wasn't allowed back in after I wrote it. But
So you actually used Yellowstone Club by name?
no, the Jefferson Club. I just altered it, but it was the whole concept of an enclave for the super rich. And in the book, it gets attacked by anti-globalists. Who take
Okay.
them all hostage on New Year's Eve.
That's very similar. I had them all in a ballroom, and mine was just kind of a lone wolf psycho. but very cunning. Maybe that's why it never sold. Maybe if I had anti-globalists in there, it would have done the trick. Or maybe if I had just written it better, which is one of my early works that never sold.
Sure.
So
Yeah, you never know. Yeah.
So it's a pleasure to meet you, and thank you for coming on. I appreciate it. I've been looking into your bios and everything, and I'm pretty fascinated by you. So so you grew up in Massachusetts, um,
Hmm.
and
Outside Boston.
okay. And what was
Yeah.
that environment like? What were your parents doing?
My dad was one of the early high tech executives. He had a master's in electrical engineering and an MBA from Harvard, and he worked in companies along Route 128. My mom was a head of personnel in another company. We were raised in largely a suburban environment until I was roughly 13 when I got a job at Fenway Park.
Oh,
And that
wow.
kind of totally changed my perspective on life because now I was in the streets around Fenway at least 3 or 4 days a week, during the summers, and you had to learn to be a tough street kid, and I
A-
did.
And your parents were okay with that.
Well, my dad was like so jealous he couldn't believe it that I got to go and work at the yeah.
Right.
They didn't know half the stuff that went on there, that's for sure.
And did you ever as an adult say, hey, there's this one time where I was nearly killed by by a gang of thugs I never told you about?
Yeah. Yeah, no, not that bad. But yeah, the stories about that place have trickled out over the years. It was a great learning experience and it was a lot of fun because I used to go into a lot of games.
Oh, I'm
I
sure.
would work, I sold souvenirs, outside the park before and after the game. But I usually had about 7 innings where you just waited and I used to buy scalp tickets and go in and watch the games.
That's all. And you probably made friends there, and
Hmm.
probably
Yeah,
lifelong friends, I would think, with that kind of environment. So
definitely.
when you say that it kind of changed everything, it made you aware of, social, maybe made you more socially aware, I'm sure, made you more aware of like, oh, this is what the world is kind of actually like.
Hmm. Yeah, that there was a world far different than suburban Boston, that there was an inner city. And at that time, Kenmore Square and the area around Fenway was pretty rough. And so I got exposed to all sorts of stuff. And I was there when there was a huge thing called the Mission Hill riots, which was not far. It was a race riot, and it spilled into the streets and came right by us. And I'll never forget that kind of thing. And just being forced to confront all these kinds of things made me aware that there was a much bigger world out there.
Well, that's fascinating. I mean, I think it's so important when you're kind of younger, very young, like, preteen to teen, that you have some kind of exposure to. I mean, that may be a little bit of an extreme example. I don't think most people will have that kind of
Yeah.
experience, but in my
Right.
case, it was just, my parents took me traveling internationally a fair amount, and just having any kind of cultural
Hmm.
exposure outside of what you're used to is completely eye opening. And it's interesting. We have a parallel that our fathers
Absolutely.
were both electrical engineers,
Hmm.
Ivy League educated. But so it sounds like the the writing gene didn't necessarily pass down from him.
No, but the storytelling gene did.
Okay.
My grandfather was a notorious storyteller in the small town of Vermont where my father grew up, and um, it was just a natural thing for me. It's part of it's just growing up in an Irish family, and everybody tells stories.
Yeah.
Uh, but I was particularly good at it, and I liked doing it, and I started writing down stories at a very young age. So that's
So
where
when
it
you
came
when you
from.
say your grandfather was a storyteller, he was making up stories and just telling them to whomever would listen, or he was passing along stories.
Yeah, he was passing along stories, things that had happened to him or that he knew about. And of course, he would embellish them
Right.
as Irish people are known to do.
Right.
And, it came from there. And it also came from my mom, who was a diehard reader. She probably read a book a day for about
Oh,
40
wow.
years.
Wow.
Yeah. So we were
Wow.
always in libraries. We didn't have a television until I was 10. Books, she taught me to read when I was 4. So books were there constantly. And I didn't even know what a television was really until I was 7 or 8. when I
Right.
saw the first one at a friend's house. It was just, you had your head in a book. That's just what you did in my family.
All the ingredients were there. And then there's that transition from like, I'm a kid and I like telling stories to, I'm going to write these down, which is actually kind of a big transition, right? Because
Mhm.
it's a pain in the ass to write, and especially for a kid
Yeah.
who wants to write stuff down. But
Yeah.
you just what did you think? Like, I want to save these. Was that the idea, or like I want to do something
Well,
with these?
yeah, the first time it happened, I was in second grade and I got in a fist fight at a parochial school with another guy. And next thing I knew, I was hanging off a hook. There was a 6 foot tall nun named Sister Mary Joseph, who was also my mother's best friend. And she was very displeased that we were fighting. And, this was when corporal punishment was totally fair game.
Oh yeah,
Yeah,
preferred.
and preferred, right? And so I expected I was going to get a ruler to my butt or something. And instead, she said, your punishment is you have to enter the grades 1 through 8 creative writing contest, short story writing contest. And I was like, what? I
Huh.
just didn't get it. And so I went home because I was petrified of her. And again, she was one of my mother's best friends. So they talked a lot. And I went home terrified that my mother was just ready to raise holy hell on me because I'd gotten in a fight in school, in parochial school. And anyway, she had no idea what was going on. And I said, I have to go upstairs. And she said, why? I said, I have to write a story for the short story contest. And so I went up, I sat at my little desk. I had no idea what to write about. And I kept waiting and waiting and nothing. And finally, I just started daydreaming and staring out the window. And this little rabbit comes burning through our backyard. And about 10 seconds later, this beagle comes burning through our backyard. And both of them disappeared into a cornfield across the street. And I went, okay. So I started writing about that. And I wrote this entire thing about this rabbit trying to get away from a beagle. And I turned it in. And about 8 or 9 days later, my parents get a call from the vice principal and the principal asking them to come down. And at the time, my father was the head of the parish council, and my mother ran the after school religious teaching. And they were very unhappy to have been brought in. And they got there, and the principal slid this paper across the table and said, which one of you wrote it? And they both looked at it, and they said, we've never seen this before. And they go, you're kidding me? And I go, no, you've never seen it before. And they go, well, he just won the whole school.
Wow.
And I did.
They didn't even give you the benefit of the doubt to begin with, though.
No, they didn't. They went right to my parents. And I had to read it in front of the whole school, and everybody cheered. And I was like, okay, I'm good at this. I'm going to keep going.
Wow,
And I
that's
did.
so there's so many interesting things about that. One, just that, that's such a sharp and instilled memory going all the
Mhm.
way back to second grade, which I guess I can understand because you won. But I'm wondering if that nun actually saw that as a punishment, a legit punishment, or she actually saw something in you where she knew that that would be influential and maybe a good inflection point for you. Who knows?
I'll take the latter one.
But isn't it interesting that that really could have, without that, it
Yeah.
could have never gone anywhere.
Right.
You always wonder, like, what are those? I think we all have that moment, whether it's sharp and vivid, or maybe we're not so aware of it, but that really puts us on the course to whatever it is that I think we're naturally talented at. And that
Mhm.
most people doesn't happen to in second grade. Most people it
Doesn't.
happens to much later. So then you knew, because you went to school and got a BA in English, so you kind of knew going into college that this
Yeah.
is my path. What was
Yeah.
your thought process in college?
Well, before college, I specifically applied to writing schools that were known for writing, and Hamilton College was one of them in upstate New York. And I applied there as early decision, and never expecting to get in, and I got in. And I basically wrote my way in. I had written a couple of short stories, and I put them in as part of my application, and that's what got me in the door. And but I was highly challenged there. This was a whole different level of studying and writing, and I struggled that first year, and then I caught my wind, and I did just fine.
Mhm. But you were kind of
And
used to being the wunderkind a little bit, probably, where you were growing
right,
up, and now all of a sudden you were amongst
mhm,
peers who were
right,
very
and a lot of
smart.
really good writers,
Yeah.
and then going into creative writing classes for the first time, and having to really think about fiction versus just a thesis or a paper, and
Hmm.
that's how it started. And I did well. I won another award in college for writing, and that was another thing that gave me a lot of hope. And but as a senior, I realized pretty quickly I had zero interest in going to work in corporate America, which is what a lot of my friends were
It's so smart to
taking.
realize that at an early age.
Well, yeah, and I knew I wanted to be a writer, but it was like, what am I going to write about?
Right.
So
How am I going to make
I
money?
yeah, and but I also wanted something interesting, that because I didn't think that growing up the way I had, despite the Fenway Park experience, that there was much there. And so I set out to have an adventure, and it came down to two things. I was offered Navy flight school to fly F-14s, and I was also offered the Peace Corps. So I went to my dad and I said, "What do you think?" And I thoroughly expected him to say Navy flight. And he said, "Peace Corps." And I went, "Well,
Hmm.
really?" And I said, "Why is that?" And he said, "Well, you've always had a severe problem with authority. You'll end up in Leavenworth."
It wasn't like I'd rather you help people than kill
No,
people. It's like if you knew you were going to
no.
get like dishonorably
Yeah.
discharged.
My personality wasn't going to jive with the military. And, I realized he was right. And so then 2 weeks after I get out of college, or 3 weeks after I get out of college, I get on a plane and I land in Niamey in Niger in West Africa. And I get posted to a place called Agadez on the ancient caravan route between Tripoli and Timbuktu. And my eyes are open, man. I mean, this was like the most startling experience of my life.
Way
And it
beyond Fenway.
way beyond Fenway, like just a massive, massive, outside the box, outside my comfort zone. I had to
Ugh,
learn, languages. I
it's
had to
great.
learn cultural mores. I had to learn how to adapt. I had to learn how to live when it was 130 degrees out. It was just this all-encompassing experience that
Hmm.
reinforced this idea that there was this massive world out there, and I would get to go see it. And I figured I could do it through writing. And near the end of my experience there, I started applying to grad schools back in the States, and I applied all to journalism schools. I wanted, because I had read a lot about the backgrounds of various writers I admired, including like Kurt Vonnegut, who had
Sure.
been a reporter early, and he had gone to a place called the Chicago News Bureau, which was like this underpaid place where you work for both the Tribune and the Sun Times, and City News Bureau is what it's called. And like, okay, that could be interesting. This would force you to deal with the world, right? To expose yourself to aspects of society that I had no idea about. And lo and behold, I wrote a story about an exorcism that I witnessed in Africa. And it got me into the Medill School of Journalism. And I struggled there too, because it was a different kind of writing. It had to be much more declarative, clear, no passive voice, no nothing like that.
Right.
And you had to write on deadline, right? You had
Right.
to write now.
Hmm.
And that was invaluable. And I took those skills, went to Washington, I worked for Reuters first in Chicago, and then went to Washington, D.C. and worked for a place called States News Service, which everybody who worked there, we used to call ourselves the boat people of American journalism, because we were paid horribly, but we got to write for some of the biggest papers in the country. And that in turn allowed me to do some investigative work in Washington, D.C. And that got me a job in San Diego, first as an urban affairs reporter. But, you know, when there's all sorts of urban redevelopments going on, there's usually corruption. And that was what I went after. And it worked. And I spent about a year on that beat before I was put full time in investigations, and stayed there for another 5 years. In that time, I turned 30, And I woke up on my 30th birthday and realized I hadn't done what I'd set out to do, which was to write novels. And it scared me. And it hit me hard that morning. And I thought about it. I told my wife something's wrong. I'm getting all these, benefits and accolades for being a journalist, but it just doesn't feel like it's what I'm called to do. And she said, well, then you better get up in the morning and start writing. And so I did. I got up early and started writing. I did that for about a year. And then I took a leave of absence and went and lived among extreme skiers in Utah and Northern California and in Jackson Hole, and wrote a perfectly horrible first draft of my first novel, but then worked with an editor and basically learned how to harness a giant narrative. And finally, after 17 rejections, it was published and became a New York Times notable book of the year.
That's amazing.
It is. But by that time, when it published, I had already quit. There were a bunch of impetuses behind me quitting, but I realized that I didn't have the emotional or stamina or the personal stamina to keep writing books early in the morning and then working 50, 60 hours a week at the newspaper. So, and then both newspapers decided to merge in town. When I got there was an all-out newspaper war that was going on between 6 newspapers, and that ended up being the subject of my second novel, Hard News. But at a certain point, they decided to merge, and 170 journalists were going to lose their jobs. And it was a toxic place because everybody was freaking out. People had families. They didn't know if they were going to still be working. And this was like in that first wave of contractions in the newspaper business. So I tried to stay focused and just do my job, figuring if I did it well, I'd still have a job. And around this time, my son was born, and he's probably 8 or 9 months old, and he's got the croup, this coughing thing. My wife goes to bed, and I'm walking up and down, and all of a sudden this infomercial comes on, and this guy's flying around the helicopter, and he jumps out with these huge teeth and this big suit, and he says, "I'm Tony Robbins, and I can change your life." And I'm like, well, I'm looking at him, and I'm saying, well, you're Tony Robbins, and you're a charlatan because you're living in San Diego, and San Diego at this time was a notorious hotbed of con men. It was, and I exposed multiple ones, and so, but I was always fair. So I ended up buying his 30 Days to Personal Power, and I figured I'd listen to one cassette tape and know it was nonsense, and then proceed on my way. Instead, I ended up listening to 30 nights, and on the 30th night, I told my wife I'm quitting my job. And I'm done. I'm going. And
wow, I have so many questions.
It turned in 4 or 5 months. I did quit my job, and she got a job in Vermont, running a rehab unit in a hospital. And I walked away from journalism and took off and started writing Hard News. And about a year later, Fall Line was accepted about a year later.
Okay, that's so interesting. That's so interesting.
I mean, he's since in the years become a friend of mine. I love him. He's a great guy.
And I wonder if it's something also that it could have kind of been anything. It happened to be him, but you needed that something to push you to make that last step. And granted, you liked him and he was valid, so that was even more helpful. But it sounds like you needed that push by some external force. So then you started publishing books. What was the reality of that versus your expectations in terms of financially, in terms of the ups and downs?
Well, I wasn't able to make my living solely on writing books at first. I did a lot of freelance work. I became a heavy magazine writer. I wrote for the Boston Globe Sunday magazine, the Washington Post magazine, Yankee magazine, a bunch of nationals. And I was able to, through money that I'd saved in San Diego, the income from magazine writing, and then the minor advances I got, I was able to get through the first 2 books. But it was getting lean by book 3, and I knew I had to do something out of the box. And I had no idea what to write about. And I talked to this guy who knew me fairly well, and he said, "Well, you love to hunt. Why don't you write about that?" And I'm like, "Well, who would read it, right?" And he said, "I don't know. I think you could write pretty interestingly about it." So I thought about that, and like out of the blue, I was assigned to this to write an article on the evolving world of deer hunting in Maine. And the culture of deer hunting in Maine, it was like incredibly deep. I mean, it goes back multiple generations. And I went up there and I did a lot of reporting and talked to a lot of people. And I ended up interviewing this guy whose wife was shot by a hunter
Oh,
while
geez.
she was out hanging clothes in her backyard. And it devastated him, obviously, and it devastated me to hear it. And all of a sudden, I started thinking about that whole scenario and story. And out of the blue, I just sort of popped into my mind that there was this estate, on the border of Alberta and British Columbia, incredibly remote, that people would go to go hunting. And out of that, it was almost like some of like the most dangerous game and some other
Hmm.
stuff. And anyway, I tried to start writing it, and I was writing it as a male, and it was like, who cares, right? And um, I was driving my wife and my two kids down to see my in-laws in Connecticut, and they were all sleeping in the car. And as I was driving, I went, "Well, what if it's a woman?"
Right.
And this was not far-fetched because I'd grown up. Several of my cousins who were female had hunted, and they were very quite good at it. They were different than men. They took a different approach and stuff. And so, I just sat there, and all of a sudden, this voice started speaking in my head, and it said, "Here lives my story. My name is Diana Jackman, but people know me as Little Crow." And it was like, well, where's this coming from? And I
Wow.
pulled over and wrote it down. And
Had that happened before? That kind of,
no,
yeah.
I'd had moments where things just sort of took over, but that was really that first experience of sort of going to another place and
Huh.
having this voice speak in my head. And, literally from when I wrote down that first paragraph over the course of the next day or so, not one word changed in the book.
Hmm.
And it guided the whole thing. And I had no idea what was going to happen. She just started telling the story, and I just took dictation and went with it. And
Yeah. That's amazing.
um, it was amazing. It was an amazing experience. And I'd written about half of it, and I was almost bust. I had to go back to work as a magazine writer, and I showed it to my agent, and she said, "If you can get to this one point in the book," because she'd seen an outline, and so I went back. This is at Christmas, and wrote to that point, and then wrote a very detailed outline of the last 225 pages and gave it to her. And all hell broke loose. 17 publishers bid on it. Um, it was just a totally different
Jesus.
experience. Yeah, yeah.
That's
And
amazing.
I never thought it would happen in a million years, but it
Yeah.
did. And the book was very well received, published in, I don't know, 13 or 14 languages. And that was the big hurdle. I tell people that
Financially.
it's financially it was a tremendous difference. I'm sorry, I'm
Yeah.
getting light coming in
Yeah.
my
You're good.
face. Um, yeah, it was a big difference financially. We were no longer in a hardship situation. We were in like, all right, you've been given every writer's dream, the
Right.
freedom to write. So go.
Right.
And
Don't squander it.
right, and about that time, my younger brother, who was also my best friend and um, the most well-read person I knew, started going off the deep end drinking, and
Hmm.
um, that entire experience with him clouded that next book. Uh, and I just started bouncing around. I wrote a book about deep caving and went and hung out with some of the world's experts on caving and did things like, went in one hole and came out 24 hours later in another hole, and wrote a book called Labyrinth that ended up selling to Paramount,
Hmm.
uh, and also, helped us. And then wrote a couple more books, and they weren't quite doing as well as we wanted, including Triple Cross, the book about the Yellowstone Club. And then my brother died. And then
Was it
we were
alcohol
having this
related?
yeah, he drank himself to death. And then I we were in this, my wife and I were in this long lingering business dispute that had taken us to the point of personal bankruptcy. And I wrote a book that I loved, and it tanked in the United States, in my opinion, through no fault of my own, because the book went on to sell almost 1 million copies overseas, but bombed here. And so it was largely a function of distribution. And it led me to get into a pissing match with my publisher, and I had to buy my way out, and it pushed us right to the point of personal bankruptcy. And one day, as people who know this story, in the winter of 2006 in February, I was driving to Costco in a snowstorm, and I realized I was worth more dead than alive. And I seriously considered driving into a bridge abutment and killing myself because it was snowing. No one would have ever suspected. And no, and I didn't do it. My wife appeared in my eyes and my kids, and I was like, I can't do this. And when I got to that Costco, as rattled as I've been in my entire life, and I put my head on the steering wheel and I begged God and the universe for a story, something that would give me purpose, something that was beyond what I was doing. And I go in, I go shopping, I go home. My wife has no idea what's going on, and she's says, "You got to go to the Robinsons for dinner tonight. I'm not feeling well." I said, "I'm not going anywhere." And she said, "You have to. We've turned them down 3 times." She said, "Just go for an hour, and if you don't feel like it, come home." So I go, and 20 minutes into the dinner party, this perfect stranger starts telling me the story of Pino Lella. And I'm like, the story of a 17-year-old boy who leads Jews escaping Nazi-occupied Italy, and then through a series of remarkable circumstances becomes a spy inside the German high command. And I'm like, what? I go, no.
Has anyone written about this before?
No. And I said, that can't be true. We would have heard this story.
Yeah.
And they said, well, I think he's alive. And I said, he's alive? How old is he? And he's 78, at the time. And I went, okay. So I went home, and I was kind of a different person, right? Because asked and answered. And my wife says, what happened to you? And I said, well, I don't know, but I'm going to make some calls. But if this has legs, I may be taking the last of our money and going to Italy and chasing a 60-year-old war story. And my wife, being my wife, she said, well, of course you are. And
wow, you found a good match.
I did. And I end up, 6 weeks later, getting off a plane, and there's Pino Lella, this big strapping guy, and we get in his little Citroën de Chevaux, and he proceeds to drive it like, a Ferrari race car through the streets of Italy. And this all becomes pivotal to understanding that this guy actually can drive like this. And I go on a 3-week odyssey with him, in which he basically unearths a story he's told parts of to other people, but never fully gotten out. And just hearing what he went through in the war at 17, all of a sudden my problems going tick, tick, tick. They're getting smaller and smaller. Right, and his philosophy on tragedy and how everyone has to deal with grief and the loss of someone. And it starts changing my perspective on life, his entire philosophy. And I leave Italy a changed person. I'm no longer seeing what's wrong in life. I'm seeing what's right, what's virtually miraculous.
Right.
And it so changes my perspective that I just said, this story can change other people's lives. If it can do it to me, it can do it to others.
Yeah. You have seemed to had multiple experiences in your life where that gratitude kind of almost like bestowed itself on you out of the blue and has changed you. And you've certainly have seemed to have been wise enough to hold on to that. So is that something, how do you practice that on a daily basis? I mean, I can see just even where you're physically located, you're in this, this place that gratitude, you should be grateful just to open your door and look outside.
And I am always. I begin every day by meditating and being highly aware of what I am grateful for. And then I go around the rest of the day, not looking for what's devastating about life, but what's miraculous about it. And, I'll give you another example. After the book was published, and was a runaway bestseller immediately, people were telling me, you'll never find another story about this. Go back to writing suspense stories. And I was like, nah, I don't think I went through this to become a different kind of writer to just go back. I'm not doing
Right.
that.
There's a reason here.
And so, and sure enough, all of a sudden I'm getting letters and emails and messages on my website about various stories. My grandfather in World War II, my aunt, this, that, and I realized that I was going to have a criteria. What was I looking for? Right. And so I went back and thought about Beneath A Scarlet Sky and why it worked. And it was because the story itself was inherently moving, inspiring,
Sure.
healing, and transformative. And so I wrote down those 4 words, and that's what I was looking for. And I came close a number of times, but I wasn't finding what I was looking for. And then I'm doing the Noontime Rotary in Bozeman, Montana, where I live. And I give my talk about Pinot Lella. It's a slideshow. I show, actual pictures from the area with him. And this guy comes up afterwards and says, do you know the Martells? And I said, you mean like the construction people? There's this big construction company in Bozeman. And I said, yeah. He said, the entire time I read Beneath, all I could think about was the story of how the Martells came to America when they were on the run from the Soviets under the protection of the Nazis in the last year of the war. And I was like, really? And so 2 days later, I put Bill Martell's address in my nav, and I go, it's like 2 miles away.
You didn't have to go to Italy.
No. And I drive down the hill, and it tells me to take a left in this older neighborhood, and I get this odd feeling as I'm driving in there. And I can't put my finger on it until I get to Bill's driveway. And I get out and I realize I can't be 250 yards from where that dinner party was where I heard Pinot's story. I mean, it was like right there.
How weird is that?
Totally. And so I knock on the door with a lot of anticipation, and I'm not disappointed because within 10 minutes of Bill starting to recount what happened, I'm sitting forward, and within an hour, I know I'm doing it. I just know because it was an incredible story. And, I ran with it, and I end up going to Ukraine with Bill and his brother, and we find the ruins of their childhood home, which is right where the book opens, right as they're beginning to run. And we end up further east in a place called Poltava on the border with Belarus. And we go into the basement of this museum, which is where their father was kept when he was a Soviet prisoner of war and almost died and had to escape. And realizing that, he'd gone into this POW camp with 2,300 people, and the night he escapes, there were only 199 left. And to be with the brothers when they were experiencing that was just incredible. I mean, they were just stunned that this is where their father had lived in the POW camp.
Wow.
And, going with them and doing that, and then retracing the route of the Martells' run, from the Soviets and under the protection of the Germans in a Conestoga wagon for all intents and purposes. And they get caught between the two armies and for a substantial portion of the book. And I was just blown away by the story. I still am. And so it was another one of these tales of incredible human endurance and perseverance and resilience.
And luck.
And luck. Yeah, a lot of luck. But I realized that also that people want to hear these kinds of stories.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, they sell huge, obviously, as evidenced by your books.
Right. So. But it's also that, I think that I'll probably get grief for saying this, but it's easier to write a book of darkness than it is of light. It is.
Well, or, darkness becoming light is,
right.
That's because it's ultimately hopeful, and people yearn for that, right? They don't.
Yes, they do.
I mean, you can write a slasher and people are like, maybe some people are attracted to that, but they want to understand, like, well, how did they get out of that? What would they do? What would I do? They want to be able to relate to it.
Absolutely.
So,
and also, I think that they also want to read about people who have done more, people who have been faced with challenges we couldn't even fathom.
Right.
And they managed to survive, and they managed to succeed. And those are the kinds of stories that I just find myself drawn to at my age. I want to tell those kinds of stories.
And I would think one of the challenges would also with everything that you're looking for is making sure you could probably hear the perfect story, and then has this been written about before? How has this not been written about before?
Right.
I mean,
Right.
that's pretty astounding too, because that takes a lot of research just to figure that out, because you don't want to be unintentionally ripping somebody off. Well, that's
right.
I mean, Mark, that's all we're running out of time, but I've got a million questions for you. So I'm so glad I got a chance to talk to you, but we're going to do a quick storytelling. This is very brief. This is the fun part. I'm just going to pick a book at random from the bookshelves behind me, and then I'll have you pick a page. This will go on for like 3 minutes or so.
Okay.
It'll be fast. I just gravitated towards one of the first writers I really got into in my 20s. So I didn't have any English classes, and I didn't get into reading until my 20s, but I really got into James Clavell. I mean, he was probably the first writer where I was just completely transformed as a reader.
Right. Swept into it. Right.
Just, I mean, and I still, Shogun to this day is probably the best romance I've ever read in my life.
Awesome.
It's so pick pick a page between 1 and 1400.
420.
Okay. And I'll just choose, like, say, the third sentence. And so I'm going to read the sentence, and then you add a sentence or two, whatever you want to add, then I'll add, and I'll just call it after a little while. But it can be whatever we want it to be. All right. Sentence number 3. Thank you. Guinea Fu was 28, and most nights she worked at the Happy Drinkers Bar in an alley off Mong Kok, half a mile or so to the north.
She went there every evening around 4 in the afternoon and stayed till 2.
She was never worried about walking home at 2 in the morning. In fact, it was one of the most freeing times of her day. There was something about the smell, the humidity, that made her feel free.
She got to leave behind the men who pawed her in the bars and plied her with drinks. She had to forget to be smiling all the time in their face. She just got to be herself.
The walk home lasted 15 minutes, and it was a time of transformation for her. But things changed once again once she opened her door.
Inside, her son was waiting, asleep on the couch, on the tatami mat by the table, and she knew she would have to be up for hours.
Her mother, who had been taking care of him, was asleep. She decided not to wake her and scold her for her negligence, because that just meant wasted time arguing. She went and scooped up her boy and took him into the bedroom.
She lay down beside him, happy that he had not stirred, and stared into space, wondering what would come next, or whether her life would be nothing but an endless repetition of that night.
As she looked down at her son, she wondered too what he would turn into. Would he be just like the men in the bar, or would he be something destined for a greater purpose? She liked to think the latter, but she struggled to believe it.
It had been that way all her life. There had been doubts set upon failure, set upon doubt. But watching the boy stir and shift in his bed, she allowed herself to dream that one day he would be different.
I think we'll call it there. That was beautiful. So
Great.
I will say, a lot of times I do this and it gets dark very fast, almost violent sometimes, depending on who I'm talking to. So, but that was very James Clavell-ish, I would say.
I think so.
Yeah. That's fantastic. What a tremendous pleasure talking to you, Mark. You're a fascinating guy. I was glad to see we had a few things in common. And you're the kind of person that I would meet at a cocktail party. I'm like, all right, I have a million questions for you. You're not going anywhere. I'm sorry if I'm boring you, but I just want to find out everything. So I'm glad I got a chance to chat with you.
You as well, Carter. That was great. Very unusual. I enjoyed it.
Fantastic. Thanks, Mark. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Okay. Appreciate it.
Take care.
Bye-bye. Bye.
That was my conversation with Mark. It was one of the the most engaging conversations I've had on this show so far. If you want to know more about him, you can go to marksullivanbooks.com. And if you want to learn more about me or subscribe to my newsletter, which, by the way, for every newsletter subscriber we get, somewhere on the earth, an endangered animal is saved. So, that's a good thing. Just go to carterwilson.com. In the meantime, thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. More episodes on the way.